Hey everyone, and welcome back to yet another episode of SAFT Podcast. We are super delighted that you are here to join us in this very exciting episode as we come to the end of this year. Now, as you know, in the past episodes, we've been walking through the Kalam Cosmological Argument as part of our lengthy series on natural theology. Now, as a quick refresher, the Kalam Cosmological Argument is an argument that shows that if everything began to exist, and if everything that begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist, then the universe must have a cause. In the previous episodes, we broke down these arguments. This specific argument, we went through the different statements and the key elements of this argument, some of the common objections, and especially in the last episode, in the just previous episode, on episode 75, we had our good friend Ashish John join us as we explored some of the common objections to the Kalam cosmological argument. And today, as I mentioned in the previous episode, Ashish John is one of the two hyper dynamic, explosive upcoming apologists of the Indian subcontinent. And today we are joined by his other half. Well, I mean, he's a bachelor, so I can say that for now. But his elder brother, Ashish John. Ashish, what a delight to have you on SAFT Podcast.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, Jacob. I'm so much delighted as you are to be a part of this podcast. I hope we'll have an exciting discussion ahead. And you taking time out to do this amidst your exams is commendable.
Thank you, Ashish. And time is of the essence. Time is money. And with that, let's ask the question on time itself. So what I want to do, the reason I specifically brought in Ashish into this topic is Ashish is a physics teacher. And whenever there's a question on science, specifically when it comes to relates to quantum mechanics or quantum realm or physics or something as simple as measuring the speed of light in a vacuum and all of that, I turn to Ashish, and we've had some lengthy conversations where Ashish tries to break down things for this non-science, commerce background mind of mine. So, in this episode, what we want to focus in is on a very complex topic, a topic that almost leaves even moderate readers into apologetics want to take a step back. It is the question on nature of time. And you may wonder, okay, what is this doing with the Kalam cosmological argument? Well, the reason is it is often alleged that a nuance in the understanding of the nature of time, a varied understanding of the nature of time, presents itself as an objection to the validity to the question of did the universe begin to exist? And that this understanding of time, some claim, overflows into even the first premise of some format. So we want to unpack what is happening with the relation of time and how we can engage and continue to engage in using the Kalam cosmological argument with whatever we can glean from knowing about the essentials of the nature of time, the different theories of time, and so on and so forth. And Ashish was my go-to person to help us alleviate these queries. So Ashish, let me ask you a question that is going to that left myself included when I was thinking about this question. Clueless. What do we mean by time? And once you define what time is, can you tell us how we measure time?
Right. So, Jacob, that's a very interesting question, and it's a very time seems to be a very familiar concept. But at the same time, time happens to be pretty much difficult to explain. In fact, it's almost impossible to explain, and theologians and philosophers and the modern day physicists have been wondering, what exactly is time since time immemorial, right? So,
Yeah.
Craig somewhere, remarked that I think Craig was quoting somebody else, and Craig said, the if you want to know how important a philosophical concept is, you have to check the amount of nonsense that is written about it. And Craig says that time is up there; it's only next to God. And so everybody has some opinion of what time is, but I'm afraid that today, to the question, what is time? Maybe I also cannot give you a definitive answer. And but we sense time because we have a sense of events progressing because we observe change, right? And
Right.
if you look at the history of Western thinking, Aristotle was probably the first person who defined something that's very close to our current definition. It says the calculable measure of motion with respect to before and afterness. So that was Aristotle's definition, and this continued for roughly maybe 2 millennium. Right? until Einstein came in the 20th century and tried to redefine what is time. Now, the
Right.
second question that you asked is, how do we measure time? All right, we measure time through clocks and watches uh, and various other devices. Historically or ancient times, we had maybe sundials, and water was used as to measure. Sand clocks were used. So all these
Oh.
devices, they have some periodicity in it, right? So pendulums, for example,
Yeah.
a pendulum makes
Yeah.
exactly one complete one complete cycle, oscillation as you call it in physics, um, in a unit time. So we can use that as a measurement for time. And there is also a psychological, intuition that you have regarding time. So, for example, that about when you talk about events, that certain events occurred, before some other events, and certain events occurred after some events. So you have this
Right.
psychological sense of time, and then you have these things that you can use to measure time, although not in a very fundamental sense. But I think I'm making sense there, right?
Yeah, and the elusive nature of trying to figure out what time is, how to measure, and the complexity of it, it gets all the more exacerbated when we talk of things like atomic clocks, clocks that are measuring time with such extreme accuracy. And yes, granted, it's for a fact that these topics are going to be beyond the reach of a common layman to grasp. But when we talk about the Big Bang Theory, and I've also often quoted this quote from Stephen Hawking where he says, time itself must have had a beginning. And that is a very radical statement for a non theist, especially for someone outspoken as an atheist voice, someone like Stephen Hawking to say, right, when he says that time itself must have a beginning, and that has a lot of consequences that follows, a lot of follow-up questions that would place him off in a back foot because of the repercussion that has for an atheist to make. But the question that came to my mind as a person who has absolutely zero clue of the complexity of understanding time and calculating it and the mathematical complexity that go behind it is, can we really say that we figured out how to prove that time began to exist? Like, is that possible for us to do? Is that too vast a claim to say that we have proved that time actually began to exist? What actually goes about in that?
Well, so from a physics perspective, um, when physicists are talking about time, they're not talking in the sense that, um, as we or as philosophers talk about in some sense. Because when you say that time is real and time is not real, what for a physicist it would mean whether the fundamental equations would a, have time in it. That's what we mean. So,
Okay.
physicists have this weird idea of a grand theory that they would discover in future. Would that would explain all of physical reality in
Yeah.
some sense. So the question that they are asking when they are talking about when they ask you the question, is time real? The real question that they're looking at is time real in the sense that would our fundamental nature of reality consist time, or is time an emergent property? So now here, different people have different opinions. Majority of physicists nowadays would say that, well, time is not fundamentally real. Okay, although we experience time, um, it's not fundamentally real. But at least
Right.
in the last few decades, there has been a counter opinion that has been emerging, and some of them are like the smartest physicists. Now, for example, I can quote Lee Smolin here. He wrote a book called Time Reborn, and he's saying that I'm quoting this from memory. He says time is the most fundamental thing that you can think about. So he's one who was a pioneer of this theory called as loop quantum gravity. um, there are problems with general theory of relativity that needs to be addressed, and therefore, some people came about with this theory of loop quantum gravity. And recently, when I was, a couple of years ago, when I was interested in this topic, I happened to stumble upon a guy called as a physicist from Geneva, if I'm not wrong, called Nicholas Gisin. And Gisin is actually a brilliant physicist. He wrote a couple of papers on the reality of time. I think paper is titled, Does Time Really Flow? Something. I'm quoting this from an article. Uh, so Nicholas Gissen has an opinion that, again, time is real. Okay, it's fundamental, and he says that the approach to mathematics should change. That's when you can actually, um, you come up with a proper, theory that would, explain a physical reality. So this has been a debate that's been going on for maybe in the physics world for maybe, since the time of Einstein, regarding the nature of time, and it's still
Right,
continuing.
right.
And there are these two camps, although at present, the physicists, most physicists would generally tend to think that time is an illusion or something like that. But there are still some brilliant other physicists who would think that in fact it is fundamental and real to the nature of the universe.
Right. And to say that time is an illusion, it's quite a difficult position to hold in terms of how we experience our day-to-day living. I'm reminded of when Anthony Flew called out Hume. He was saying that Hume would be in a study room in his office, and he would make these very claims about truth and relativity and all of that. And then once he steps out of that study, once he stepped out of the room, in reality he would not take such a relativist position. I think that's seen quite rampant even in our dialogues with atheism also. That it's to hold on to a position they would make some rampant claim, and then but the moment we try to apply it in our real life, it is quite difficult to make sense of the fact that that is really true. And I think the same can be said about time as well. To say time is an illusion, but how do you apply that in your day-to-day living? How do you make sense of your raw encounter with reality? But again, that would take us too far off field, a discussion of that. Now, when we talk about time, one phrase that keeps up coming up is the phrase or terminology, space-time continuum. What is space-time continuum mean, and what does that basically tell us about the universe?
All right, so space-time continuum, to understand what the term actually means, you have to go a little bit into the history of physics. So 100 years ago, before Einstein published his famous paper, the physics that existed was classical physics, or Newtonian physics. So in Newtonian
Right.
physics, yeah. So in Newtonian physics, time is independent, uh, you know, and is outside the frame of reference. So any observer in any frame would perceive time, equally. I mean, equally or in the same manner, I must say. But what happened with Einstein is that, of course, it's not as if Einstein just came about and gave his paper. Classical physics was having some problems for roughly maybe 2 or 3 decades. That was they were trying to resolve it, and it was not happening. And then finally, Einstein came up with this brilliant idea. And then, so in his paper, the idea that he suggested was, you cannot see time as outside of space, right? You have three-dimensional space, and then you have a fourth dimension, if you want to call it that way, a fourth dimensional time. So every observer, you know, uh, so see, all of this is, it's not just space, it's space-time continuum, and time is not absolute for all frames of reference. So each observer in a frame of reference would view time differently. So, and maybe if you want me to elaborate a little bit, I know that frame of reference and all these things could be maybe a
Yeah.
new concept to some of our viewers. So maybe frame of reference is just basically, let's say I am sitting here and I'm looking at these things. So all the events that are happening here with respect to my rest frame is my frame of reference, right?
Okay.
So a person who is outside, who is going on a car, right? He's moving at some velocity. This is an example that I like to give my students. So I ask them, what will happen if I throw a ball up, and where would it land? And they would say, okay, it will land on my hand, right? And then I ask the question, what if I'm in a train and I do the same thing, right? You are standing outside the train in a platform and you're watching me throw a ball up, right? And what do you think will happen? So if the train is moving with a very constant speed, then the ball will definitely land back on my hand, right? Although it's not very intuitive when you think of it that way, because some students would tend to answer that this ball should go back, right? So these are different frames of reference that you look in. One is in motion and one is at rest. So Newton said that time would be absolute. There is an absolute frame of reference where time is absolute in the sense that both the observers, for both the observers, time passes on equally. But Einstein came and said, no, that's not the case. It's space-time continuum, because space and time is kind of wrapped up together. You cannot separate it. Did I make sense, or was it too much?
Yeah. I mean, you've actually mentioned these same examples to me when I was also asking the question of the figuring out time and speed of light and all of that. So when you were mentioning this, all of this was coming back to my mind as a refresher. And there is obviously there's a lot to go through when we try and answer any of these questions. But now we are coming to this was just sort of like an intro to get your brains sort of like an icebreaker for your brains in this intellectual talk, to get into now the key of what we want to cover. And I think we have, if I look at the time, I think we have around 20-25 minutes on our hand to get through the next bit of what we have. And that comes down to the theories of time. Now, for most of us, this is going to be brand new. But Ashish, what are the two theories of time?
Well, we have the A theory of time and the B theory of time. The A theory of time is sometimes referred to as presentism, although I think presentism is one view among the A theorists. And the B theory of time is actually called as eternalism. So in the A theory of time is what a layperson who has never heard about any theories of time would hold on to. A theory like, it's called as the common sense notion of time, where the present is now when we are actually doing this thing. The past has already happened. It's no longer there. And the future is yet to happen. So that's the A theory of time. The B theory of time is it's something like, the past, present, and future all exist together. An example that's commonly used is a ruler. Right? A ruler would start from 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inch. So 2 comes after 1 and 3 comes after 2, but all of them exist simultaneously or at the same time, right? So all events that has happened in the past, that is happening in the present, and that will happen in the future, all of them exist, in some real sense. The only way you can talk about events is, in a sense that earlier than and later than, right? That's how you talk about events in the B theory of time. And this A and B distinction, why do we call them A and B? That's because of a philosopher by the name of J.E.M. McTaggart and his A series and B series, right? So he has written a paper called as The Unreality of Time, if I'm not wrong. Yeah. And that's where this terminology comes in, A theory and B theory. So that's a short introduction into the A theory and B theory of time.
Right. So to recap for our audience, the A theory of time tells us that the present that we are experiencing, each moment in the present is real. The past no longer exists. It is no longer there. And the future has not happened yet. But on the B theory, every moment that we can conceive, our past, present, and future all exist as real, and they really do exist right now. So the B theory of time would be more like how space exists, right? California is there right now. It's just a matter of it being this many kilometers far away from me. But it is there. And in the same way, in the B theory of time, tomorrow actually exists. It is just this many moments away from me right now, but it is actually real there. I think that would intrigue a lot of people to think, oh, well, is time travel possible on B theory of time? Because you just have to devise a mechanism that can traverse these many moments and get you to the future faster than it would take you like 24 hours to get there. But again, that would take us too far off field. Now, you said that the A theory of time is the common sense notion of time. It's what we all understand. The past is no longer there. The future has not come yet. And only the present is here. But what do you think is true? And why do you think one theory is true and the other is false? If you could just quickly breeze us through that in a couple of minutes.
Right. So, no, I'm not an expert on time. Neither I'm a philosopher. Who can comment very, in a very authoritarian manner, in a very, I don't know which word to use there. Authoritative manner would be the correct word to
Right.
use. But
Yeah.
anyway, as a layman and as a layman apologist, my so how I think about it, I lean towards the A theory of time because common sense theory of time. Secondly, my problem and the reason why I take the A theory of time to be much more logical and would tend to reject the B theory of time has to do with free will. Now, we might not get into free will in this video or maybe sometime later, but to keep it short, if the B theory of time is true, then probably the future exists in some real sense. And if the future already exists, then you got no free will, right? And that's not very. I mean, that's not very. I won't say it's easy to digest, but I would say I have other arguments that would support, why we have free will, and maybe might not get into that. But because of free will, I don't think B theory of time is a valid picture of reality. A theory of time is a common sense notion of time, is what we experience. We all know, as you know, in fact, Nicholas Gisin, the one person that I just quoted about his idea of time, he makes a very interesting, he says something like this. I'll just quote that for you. He says, I am a physicist who has my feet on the ground. Time passes. We all know that. So everybody knows that time indeed passes. It's a very it's something that is real. You know that's happening. So that's why a theory of time is common sense. Now the problem is, maybe we'll get into that. People tend to think that science has somehow proved the B theory of time, and that's not the case. Although modern physicists would lean to uh, eternalism and those kind of ideas, but there are equally good arguments to back up a theory of time. So don't get me wrong here. It's not an anti-scientific position that I'm taking. It is much more of a philosophical position that I'm taking. And you have good arguments to back it up as well.
Okay, so that is a lot of fascinating, tough matters to take in, and so what I would want to clear up is, how does the general theory of relativity and special theory of relativity play into this discussion? Because some say that the special theory of relativity is a proof, or it favors the B theory of time, and that may come off as a challenge to the A theory. Because I mean, for someone like me, I don't know what is the difference between general and special theory of relativity, whether one is true or whether one is false. But when someone says, oh, here is an established theory in science that favors one theory, for a layman, it comes off as, okay, what to say next? Now, I know that answering that would take us down a rabbit hole of answering so many details. But if you were to sift through it and give us an abbreviated response and answer to walk through, what would it be?
Well, uh, people tend to think that Einstein's um, special theory and general theory is some sort of a proof for A theory and B theory. But what you should be understanding is that the A theory and B theory and that discussion existed, long before Einstein's idea or Einstein's theory comes into the picture. Then again, you also have to understand that the 1905 paper that Einstein wrote, he was working it on an absolute understanding of time. That is an A theory of time. It was only, I think, Minkowski who kind of, interpreted um, the special theory and who kind of formulated um, things in physics, where he actually approached it from a B theory sense. But that does not
Right.
prove that it's Einstein's special theory of relativity is not a proof for the B theory. Right? In fact, if you talk about the current Nobel Prize, which was given to John Clauser and Alain Aspect, and there was one more person, I forgot his name. They were working on Bell inequality, and I'm not get into Bell inequality, and there is actually you know a quantum entanglement, and uh, there is a case where you actually took entangled particles, if you take them far apart, you know, and if you if you try to um, observe a particular uh, value, or if you were to experimentally determine a value of one of the properties of the one of those particles, the other particle would collapse and give you the result. And this is only possible in terms of the A theory of time. All right. So there are areas in physics that uses the A theory of time. In fact, even in quantum mechanics, we have we have to assume. Of course, there are different interpretations of how you view quantum mechanics, but you have to assume that at least in some sense there is time that flows. Right. For example, if you observe a particle, the particle's wave function would collapse, and that's an irreversible process. So you are actually you know making some sort of a what do you call it, a cause and effect thing, and that would imply that time is indeed flowing. So there are areas in physics that requires a treatment of or an understanding of the A theory, and this is one of the major
Right.
disagreements between Einstein's theory of relativity and um, uh, you know quantum mechanics. It does not fit together. One of the reasons is because the fundamental nature of time is not similar in these two theories. In Einstein's theory, you have time as a part of space time, but that's not the case with
Yeah.
in quantum mechanics. There is no observable called time. So when people raise this objection, it's because they don't have a correct understanding about, I won't say physics, because I've heard good brilliant physicists also raising up this issue. It's because they don't have a correct understanding of what time, the correct philosophical understanding and its relation to physics and reality. And also, they don't understand it in a sense when philosophers use time, what are they talking about, and what was Einstein talking about. And so these things are quite complicated, and people, language becomes a barrier, and that's some of the reason why you get these repeated objections against the A theory. I hope
Right.
I
Right.
made it clear.
Yes, yes. And here comes the crux of this episode. And it's coming towards the end, but the crux is the Kalam Cosmological Argument works on the A theory of time. And Dr. Craig also in his book Reasonable Faith, in the chapter that he dedicates to the Kalam Cosmological Argument, talks about how the argument works on the A theory of time. But now my question to you is, does the Kalam Cosmological Argument, as we are familiar with, as presented in Dr. Craig's work, does that version of the argument work on the B theory of time? And if it doesn't work, if that is the case, that that specific format doesn't work, has there been work from any other philosopher or scientist to make the Kalam or a variation of it work on the B theory of time?
All right. So most of the people tend to think that the Kalam does not work on the B theory of time. And the reason for that is because Craig is a proponent of the A theory of time. And Craig gives a good amount of logical reasoning and, sound logical reasoning to accept the A theory of time. And these ideas are crucial when he talks about whether God is temporal or timeless and these things. And I believe the book where he defends his ideas, is that called Time and Eternity?
Yeah, yeah, he has done a major work in the book Time and Eternity. Yeah, Time and Eternity.
Time and Eternity, right? Yeah, where he actually defends his views on A theory. But when you're talking about Kalam, the only place where the A theory comes into picture is where he talks about this infinite regress, right? I think for the premise two, he gives an argument from the infinite regress,
Yes.
and that's where the A theory comes into picture, because you're talking about events that come into existence. So that is where um, where Craig is actually using the A theory, but that does not mean that the Kalam in itself requires, um, you know, the A theory is a prior requisite for Kalam to be true. In fact, you can have a very sound argument uh, for Kalam in the B theory term. Even Andrew Locke has done work on it. I have not gone through his work,
Yeah.
but he states that his formulation of the Kalam does not require does not favor A or B theory. Irrespective of which theory of time that you hold on to, the theory works absolutely fine. But
Right.
an interesting paper I found out, when I was interested in these topics a few years ago, was by Curtis Metcalf. He it's not a very rigorous paper because it was not written as a PhD thesis or anything like that. He was actually a master's student, and it was his master's thesis, if I'm not wrong. So he actually frames the Kalam in the B theory of time, where you can actually avoid objections that come against the A theory of time. So premise one goes something like this: anything with time that has a moment t1 at which it is indexed as having existence, plus no moments indexed as prior to t1 at which it has existed as a cause. So what the first premise is saying is that, see, whenever we are talking about the B theory, we are talking about indexed facts, right? So if you are talking about some moment t at which some index fact is existing, and also it does not exist uh, prior to that. You cannot say before that, it exists prior to that moment t1, then it must have a cause. So the second premise would be the universe is within time and has moment t1 at which it is indexed and as having existence, plus no moment index that's prior to t1 at which it existed. So the universe exists within an indexed or is indexed between some time frame and beyond, prior to that time t, it is not existing, and therefore the universe must have a cause. So that's how the flow of that argument happens. So even if you're saying that you don't agree to the A theory of time, what uh, you know, it doesn't change anything, because at least the universe, the space time, and everything began to exist. If I were to use the word began, and even if that happened, it happened at some moment, okay, before which it was not there, right? So if it happened at some moment before it which did not exist, then it should have a cause. Now, happened at a moment before it did not existed is again terminologies that you would take over from the theory of time. But just to make sure that our viewers also will follow what I'm trying to say. You still need to have a cause. And the beauty about the B theory is that, not the beauty, I would say, because, there could be objections on the B theory of time also. But one advantage, I would say, is that you have these Al-Ghazalian, paradoxes, where when you're talking to people who oppose the Kalam, they would always come up with the Hilbert-Sautel and infinite regress. And, when we throw up Hilbert-Sautel, they would come up arguments against, that reasoning, and this goes on back and forth. But if you're talking about or if you're talking of Kalam in the perfectly in the sense of the theory of time, these kind of objections would not have any value there, because now we are not talking about time going from a moment to moment, right? Or events happening at a moment and not happening at a later moment, or ceasing to exist, coming into existence, existing and ceasing to exist. We are not talking about time in that sense. So what happens is such kind of objections would have hold no face value in a B theory term. That is one of the advantages of B theory of using Kalam in a B with the B theory of time. But again, it's wrong to assume that you need the A theory of time for Kalam to work. That's not true, and that doesn't hold water. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And yeah, that is actually a whole lot covered in the few minutes. And we are at the very last end of this podcast. And I'm going to club two questions together. And actually, if you can answer that in, let's say, 3 to 4 minutes, that would be splendid. And this is where I think this question is going to relate a lot to our lay people audience. And this was a question that was bugging my mind for a long time also. how do I, as a lay person, handle an objection on from the B theory of time when it comes to me when I'm talking about the Kalam? So that's first question. How do I handle an objection from the B theory of time as a lay person? And the other question is, and sort of like an offshoot, how much about the B theory of time should I know before I can confidently use the Kalam?
Well, okay. So Jacob, when I started, the first time I heard the Kalam argument was when it was also the first time that I happened to listen to Dr. William Lane Craig. It was his debate with Christopher Hitchens, and where he presented the Kalam cosmological argument. It was quite impressive. And the excellent thing about Dr. Craig is how he's able to, even though he's a philosopher of the highest standard and quality, he's probably one of the best philosophers who is out there. He has this wonderful talent of explaining complicated things in a very simple manner. So for me, I was not introduced to any of these ideas. This was probably roughly around 2013 or something. And I was impressed by the argument. Right? I was not aware of the A theory, B theory distinctions. I was not into college at that time. So for me, it was a very, very logical and commonsensical argument. And that's why Kalam works so. Now,
Right.
whenever
Yeah.
you present this to an atheist, uh, whenever you present this to an atheist, what happens is if the atheist has never heard about the Kalam, in most of the time, or almost in all cases, he is dumbfounded by the argument. And then what generally would happen is go back to the internet and search about Kalam, and then maybe look up against the objections of Kalam, and then come up with the B theory. Right? So, if you are a Christian who is eager to share the gospel using Kalam, the best way is equip yourself, and we live in a time of information. You don't have to go anywhere. You have the internet. There is you yourself have done a lot of couple of videos and articles on Kalam. Dr. Craig himself takes time to respond to objections. Capturing
Yeah.
Christianity is there, who has a couple of videos on Kalam. I would also ask the audience to refer to Dr. Andrew Lowe. I had been listening to him for past some time. Very, very interesting. He puts out videos on YouTube, at different channels. And so there are these information, and if you're looking into physics, and if you want to actually look into the physics side of it, want to know about space time, and there are a lot of good channels who just talk about physics. One of my favorite is Sabine Hausenfelder. I forgot her channel's name, but you can type her name out.
Oh
She has
yes.
a
Yeah.
lot
Yeah.
of. She was on Justin Brierley's one of his podcasts, I think, with Luke Barnes. She has got these beautiful. I mean, she's not a Christian, of course, but she has got these beautiful videos, short videos, where she explores these relations between physics and philosophy and those ideas. So, very brilliant physicist as well. So, there are a lot of information out there, uh, and you can readily equip yourself. That's my request to all of you who are listening to me. There is information out there free of cost. I mean, it's free of, and this has never happened in the entire history of humankind. You never had so much information free of cost. So please utilize those things and equip yourself is what I would like to point out here.
Wow, thank you, Ashish, and that was a great point to conclude the whole discussion on this very complex and difficult topic that may put us on a back foot. But that is the whole point of what TCD, SAFT Apologetics, and all of the initiatives do. We want to make even more information readily available at your fingertip for free of cost, so that you can confidently share the gospel, evangelize, and give reason for your hope. And so, Ashish, once again, thank you so much for being here, taking your time out of your busy schedule and being here with us on SAFT Podcast and helping us walk through this rather intimidating but a problem that we need not really fuss about too much when we're talking about the Kalam.
It's been my pleasure.
All right, and thank you all for joining us. Do check out the Carpenter's Desk. We'll be dropping their channel description and all of the details in the link. And we hope you will check out our previous videos to know more about the Kalam Cosmological Argument. And if you're curious about what all we have done in discussion of this argument in the past, And so we shall see you in the next episode on Christmas Day. Until then, take care and God bless.